Hello guys, welcome back. Today I'm going to do a tutorial that is a little bit different from the previous tutorials, and instead of just giving you the straightforward rules, I thought I would put them into practice and actually do a little drawing from the beginning till the end, sort of like a follow along thing where you can draw with me and you can follow along, or you can just watch the process. So let's start. I have chosen to do something very simple. It's just going to be an apple. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to start with a simple form. So I'm going to start with a circle, and I do have a separate video where I explain best ways to start an object using simple geometric shapes. So it has lots of helpful tips on how to start drawing most simple objects. Now, next step is bringing this apple to be more of an apple. So this is more or less a rough shape of it. Now I'm going to put through some shadows. I know I haven't done a video where I'm explaining how the shadows and light falls. It is in the future. I will do it in the next couple of months. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss that one. Now my next step is, because this apple is sort of sitting on this table, that meets the wall. It's a little bit tricky for me to do this because of the way things are set up with the camera. Okay, so next step is to do the shadow. Because we are working from an image, you pretty much just follow the information that's already there. Okay, so now we have more or less of a rough sketch going on here, and just move this a bit like that. And what I would like to do next is to start shading. Now, one of the ways, okay, it's just one of the ways, there are lots of different ways to start shading, but one of the ways is to start with the darkest spot. And I think for this setup, because we have only one object here, I think it would be the best way to actually start from the darkest spot. How would we do this? So I've been using a 4B pencil to just sketch all of this out. I'm going to go for a darker, a softer pencil, like this 6B, and I'm gonna have a look very carefully at the image and determine what's the darkest spot for me is, and I think it's this area here, the falling shadow that is the closest to the object. Okay, so I would shade that. As dark as I can, just in that little area there. And what this would do is it will allow me to compare every other shade to that shade. So that way I'm not going to make shadows that are semi-dark, extremely dark, and then not being able to go a shade darker, because this is the darkest that my pencil goes. And when you're shading, it's also a good chance to correct the shape a little bit, you know, whatever you've sketched. I think it's a little bit narrower here. Okay. So next, I'm going to go back to my 8B pencil, and I'm going to shade through the rest of the shadow. I'm also going to grab a piece of paper to help me not to smudge the other areas. I do have a video on best papers to use, how to use them, who this suits, and so on Patreon. So if you would like, you can go and check those videos there. And as we see that the shadow gets a little bit darker as it goes towards that wall side there.
Also depending on the kind of light that you would get, the light source, you might get really sharp, strong shadows, or sometimes you can get really soft, hazy shadows. So this shadow is sort of, doesn't have really sharp edge to it, so we're going to soften it.
Okay, so now we've marked this shadow here. I call them falling shadows, but you have to remember that when I call certain things, sometimes I just do a straightforward translation from Russian, because I was taught all of these things in Russian. It might sound strange, I mean, you'd still understand them, but yeah, it might be a bit different from what you normally hear artists say. Okay, so now let's clear up this line here. So that's part of the shadow. I'll just shade it a little bit, we can come back to that later. So I'm using the cross-hatching technique at the moment to shade. I do have a video on different shading and mark making techniques. I will link it down below so you can watch it if you haven't seen it yet. but I'm going for a really soft sort of a look as well, so I'm not exaggerating the lines. Okay, so now let's start looking at the apple. We might come back and add, you know, extra bits there, but for now we'll just leave this and start to concentrate on the actual object. So let's start on the dark part on the apple as well. So the darkest part, even though not as dark as here, but quite dark, is that little area where it caves in slightly. So the side of the apple blocks the light and therefore creates the shadow. Especially on this little spot here. We can also see a little sort of a leftover branch bit. Alright, so now if we look very carefully, you'll see that there is at the lightest spot, which is the highlight, you know, that's the lightest light, that's just sort of right there. Okay, and then you've got another area which is like a semi-light, where it's light but it's not the highlight, and then you've got the semi-shadow, sort of like a half shadow, where you see a bit of a shade but it's not the pitch black, you know, the darkest shadow. And now this area here would be the darkest shadow of the object. So I'm not going to shade this just yet, the darkest that it is, because I want it to be blended in. Also, if we look at the apple, we get the shadow, and then we get the natural patterns on it as well, you know, the texture of it, the little spots and things. It depends. You can go ahead and only look at the shadows and don't worry about the spots and things, you know, if it's too hard, or you can go in into like the tiniest little details and finish everything as well. So as we're looking, so this is the light spot. Now let's look at this area here as well. So we've got some shadows, some darker shadows going around there, and then we've got some semi shadows, semi light, and we've got the highlight, which is around there somewhere. Okay, so when you're drawing, you would be going over some things that need to be lighter, but this is what we've got erasers for. So you can use your rubber to completely erase your pencil marks, or just softly lighten them up. And I also have a video for that, which I will link down below. It's on graphite materials, where I discuss different things, including erasers and other things. Now I'm just using short little lines in a cross-hatching style to just apply a little bit of the shadow. Now the cool thing about using lines is that they also help you to describe the shape. So if you think about it, we are trying to create this illusion. We're trying to create a 3D illusion on a 2D surface. Anything that can help you do that, anything that can help you pretty much fool the eye, is good. So number one, it's shadows. We're creating shadows where they would naturally be created, with creating darker areas with your pencil. We also can help that by putting in the lines. So if you're one of those people that loves to do cross hatching or just hatching techniques, they can also really help. Okay, so now I'm going into the semi-shadow area. If you look at it, it's almost like this blurry line there that separates the light. and the shadow. And you always compare. Now if we look at the apple here, for example, and we look at the background, even though this is the falling shadow usually is considered to be darker, because apple itself is quite a dark red shade and that backdrop is sort of like almost white, you will see that the apple's shadow is actually darker than this one. So we can go in and we can create quite a dark value. It's always a matter of comparing things. That's why sometimes when people say, oh no, you're supposed to have falling shadows darker than the shadows of the object, most of the times it is true, especially if the object and the, you know, whatever the surface next to it is or backdrop is a very similar value, you know, or even a similar color. But when you've got these kind of differences, you always need to compare. So whenever you are drawing something, make sure that you compare one area to the other. It's also really helpful, you know, how we started with the darkest spot here. So you can always compare all of your other shades to that particular spot. So for example, if I'm not sure, is this dark enough or is this too light? Just look on the actual object if you're drawing from life, or on the photograph if you're working from the photograph, and always compare what is darker, this or this, and by how much. In my situation, the way I see it with my eyes at least, this spot is still a little bit darker than this, even though this here is pretty dark, but this is still darker. So I'm not going to go as dark as this. Okay, so now I'm going to use 7B pencil, and I'm going to go and create a little bit more of a shade. On the actual apple. So this area is a little bit darker. So as you can see, we're just layering the shades and getting it darker and darker. We can do the same thing later on with eraser and remove areas that we think are too dark. So see, you always, whenever you're drawing anything, especially when you're working on something even more complicated than this is, you know, pretty straightforward. It's just a one object sort of a situation. If you are working on things that involve lots of different objects, and you might work on some area and you think, okay, I'm gonna leave this, so for now I'll consider it finished. But you have to remember that none of the areas are completely finished until the whole thing is finished, because as soon as you add more shade here, you might decide that this needs to go darker, or vice versa, you put the highlight in there and then this area seems too dark. So always remember that it's not finished until the whole thing is finished. And those of you who are like real beginners, never stress out that your work doesn't look right in the process. I get this a lot with my students as well, when the work is halfway through or even a quarter way through, and they feel very disappointed with what they've got, and they feel like they want to throw away the drawing and not continue because to them it looks, ugly. The thing is, you don't get to a specific stage until you pass stages of, what you'd say half finished, maybe ugly, or it doesn't look like the finished work. It's not meant to. When it's halfway through, it's meant to look like a halfway through drawing. So don't judge yourself too harshly while you are in the process. And then there's a bit of a shadow on the apple before we get to the area of the reflex. Now I know that, as I said before, I'm probably using different names for all these things, but what the reflex is almost like, if I was to describe it, it's almost like a line on the object that becomes a little bit lighter. So you've got the shadow and then that lighter line, and then you've got the falling shadow from the object. So what it does is that it visually separates the object from the shadow, especially in these, in between these two dark areas. Now what this is, it's not a made up notion or anything like this. It actually does exist. Even if you don't draw, if you pay attention to objects around you, you would be able to see that when you've got an object next to perhaps another object or on some other area, you would be getting the light that's falling onto the area, bouncing off and falling back onto the object. This is how this lighter line is created. Now it's even trickier when you start painting, because when we use color, there'll be a little bit of that color that would be bouncing off and going onto this object. So for example, if I have this beautiful red apple and the table it was standing on was bright blue, then this line there would have a little bit of the blue in there as well. So that's how all of the objects are kind of connected. So yeah, I hope it's a helpful little tip. And you can always go back with a putty rubber and lighten things up. Again, I've got a video on this stuff as well that I'm going to put a link in the description below. Okay, so now I'm going back into shading. So as you can see, I am still using the cross-hatching technique, but in quite a soft sort of a way. Okay, so this was 7B that I've been using. Now I'm going to go into 2B pencil. There it is. 2B, because I'm going to work on these areas that still have a little bit of a shadow, but nowhere near as dark as, these dark shadows. And remember, at any point we can go back and we can add darker shades, and you don't need to feel that, oh, this is not dark enough, I need to finish this. Always make sure that your drawing is progressing, if not at the same, but at least at a very similar level. So another sort of a thing that can get in the way of you being happy with your drawing is when you focus on one area and you get it to perfection. Like every single, transition from one shade to the other is all finished. It's all perfectly, finished, smooth, or whatever technique you're using. But you haven't done anything here. So then when you start to work on the apple, for example, you realize that you've gone too dark or too light, or it just looks too artificial because it looks like a separate chunk that's been cut off from another picture and just stuck on there. That's why I suggest always try and make sure that most of your work is undergoing some kind of a process. Okay, so here in this area we've got two things going on. Number one is the shadow, and number two is the actual pattern that's happening on the apple as well, the little dashes. Of red, but we're not working with color, so we're just going to be working in them in pencil. And I'm just going to pause for a minute and remind you guys to sign up and subscribe if you haven't done that. And if you're liking what you see, give it a thumbs up. Now back to work. Okay, now as we come into this area here, this is sort of a light area, but it's still not as bright as the highlight. We want to go quite light, so I'm going to swap. This is 2B, so I'm going to swap for a harder pencil, which is this one is an H. So you can see right away the difference. There's a bit of a highlight there as well, but we'll get that with the putty rubber a little bit later. Okay, so I'm just going to soften a bit of a light there. I'm going to erase these lines that I used to mark the highlight. Now I'm going to go back to 4B pencil. I'm actually going to correct the shape a little bit. I'm going to take it just a little bit higher. Just tiny little bit. So I'm shading some of these a bit darker. See, now that I've covered this area, these don't seem dark enough, so I'm going to shade them a bit deeper. I'll have to go back and highlight that bit again. So see, now here I'm using a bit of a back and forth technique. So I'm not using as much of a cross hatching, but just sort of a squiggling a little bit. This side here is extra dark as well. It's creating quite a bit of a contrast between these two surfaces. I'm going to shade over this highlight because later on I'm just going to lift some of this up with the rubber. Okay, there's almost like a darker line almost in that area going through as well. And now we can start softly putting through some of these apple markings as well. I won't put all of them through, otherwise we'll be here until tomorrow, but I'll just mark them through a little bit, some of them, just to give it, you know, that sort of a feel. You almost can't see them on the bottom, I think, because of the shadows. Just put a couple through. And now I'm going to work over them to blend them in even more. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go completely over the highlight, but really, really lightly, and then I'm going to pick it off in certain areas with the eraser a little bit later. The best practice is really to draw from life. It can be a little bit problematic, like for me here, if I put something there, it's going to look different on the camera than it would on, you know, for me and for you. So I've decided to take a photograph and use that. But when I was a student in Russia in art school, we had a specific lesson that was called drawing, and we would have to go in there for pretty much still life drawing every time. And they would use different objects. They would use like jars and plates and things like that, and I just put these different compositions in front of us, and we had to draw them with, like, say, a piece of cloth behind them or something like that, you know, like really classical, very, very traditional. And you had to do it in a reasonably realistic way, you know. I mean, you had to structure everything. You could use your own style of shading and things like that, but you had to do it in a realistic manner. And a lot of the props that they were using were quite strange, like really, really old stuffed birds that pretty much had no feathers on them, right? But our teachers would demand that we draw them or paint them, say if we were using watercolor, as if they were brand new, you know, with all the feathers and things. So we kind of had to make things, like beautify things almost. And there was this really funny story once where we were given this jar with like an artificial fruit, which would normally get, and a lot of this artificial fruit was very old, very badly damaged, most of the paint chopped off, so you couldn't tell exactly what it was. You sort of, like, we just assumed it was an apple. It was like a really, really dark burgundy, like a wine color, sort of a round thing, with some bits missing. So we thought, okay, well, this must be an apple. So we all drew an apple, and our teacher got really mad because apparently it was a pomegranate. So so yeah, those were funny days. Now I think I need to prolong that really dark shadow. This is the, you know, that darkest shadow that we did first. So it definitely is the right level, but now I sort of feel that it needs to go just a bit further out this way. I hope this is not getting too shiny, because graphite, especially when it gets quite dark, becomes very reflective. Okay. Now I'm going to go back in with a 2B and work on this shadow that's not too dark. Usually I like to turn the paper around to make it a bit easier for me, but it's a little bit tricky with the setup I've got here with the board sort of going up. And yeah, but at home, if you're following along, make sure that you can turn your paper around, you know, that you're sitting comfortably, because it does make process a bit faster and a bit easier. So you see now what's going on is, now that pretty much all of the surface area that I wanted to cover is being covered, but the main sort of areas, but now we're just fine-tuning all the shadows one against the other. So as you finish one side a bit more, then you realize that you need to do more work on this one. As you finish this one a bit more, you realize that you need to, you know, shade this or highlight this. So Whenever you're drawing, just remember to always go back and around and have a look. Yeah, the apple pattern is quite strong here, so I'm going to darken some of these little bits. Yeah, this area here is extremely dark, so I'm going to go for a deeper shade with 6B. And you see now that I'm deepening this shade here, I can definitely see that now I need to darken this because this is contrasting too much with this. So we can soften it up just a little bit. Sometimes I get asked this question, how much of a contrast, do you want to create in your work? And the thing is, it is such a personal thing. I know some artists that work in such a soft way that these shadows, they would show them in this sort of a shade, in a very, very light way, very sketchy, very eerie. And some artists go almost like they're using, for example, charcoal, like really, really dark and really light. A lot of contrast, so it almost looks like it's been a photograph that's been sort of played with, but in a Photoshop or something. It really is up to you. This is the kind of a thing where it's your personal preference. Just make sure you get the look that you want. That's my advice. But if you are working, in a really light, soft way, there's nothing wrong with it. Or vice versa, if you're going for a really harsh, very strong style, then again that can be quite cool as well. So I'd say I'm somewhere in between. I do like a bit of a contrast, but I don't go like too dark where it's almost like black and white. Okay, let's add a couple of darker spots here, some here, and that little beauty spot on the apple. As I said, I'm not going to do them all exactly the way they are, just because the video is going to be way too long. Okay, so now what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to just darken that area a bit more, because when you look at the photograph, you can see that sort of a stronger line. And now I'm going to start going back in there with the rubber. So few stronger highlights that are right there, just right inside the little part. It's not very even, obviously, because you know it's a natural, sort of, it's a fruit, so it's not like a man-made perfect round thing. So we get little ridges there that reflect the light a bit differently. Put more there, and now a little bit of the highlight there. Almost looks like there was some kind of an object or something. I don't even remember what was there. That was a bit of light. And now we're going for the strong highlight. See, I'm reshaping the rubber to suit the shape that I need. I think I'm gonna soften these as well now that this area is lighter. These seem a bit too strong, so I'm going to take them back a little bit. Not get rid of them completely, but just soften some of these sunspots out. Same here, just lightly soften them up, and then I'll go over them with a pencil again, so you can see how it's pretty much just going back and forth. You're removing some, you're adding some, you're removing, you're adding, until you're happy with it, or as close as you can be to happy. Okay, so for exercises you can do things like that. You can also finish a little bit around as well, you know, like give a little bit of a background, sort of a shade as well. It can be quite good as well for in terms of getting the exercise going, you know, comparing the shades and all this can be quite good. Okay, but for now let's just really softly go back to the shadows and kind of haze them out into the background. So this is an H pencil I'm using. It's really light on that side, but not as light as the highlight, so I'll be just shading it just tiny little bit. And now I'm going to go for 2B pencil. It's quite strange, but there's like a lighter line almost going through there, so that's why I'm leaving that little bit. I think you naturally can get this, but I think also because this is like a fiberglass sort of a thing, so the light sort of follows through it quite in quite a strange way. And when you're comparing shades, almost make sure that nothing's obstructing your view. So like if you're using a paper like this, make sure that you take it back when you're looking at everything and comparing all the shades and highlights and things like that. Okay, so now I'm going to put my paper like this, so I can do this. And whenever you're drawing anything that curves, always make sure you need to adjust if you're left-handed, but always make sure that you use it this way, because it just makes for your hand so much easier to work in this manner. I actually have a full video on this topic on my Patreon, so if you're interested about how to draw circles with just using your wrist as a instrument, then you might enjoy that video. Okay, and now I'm going to go for a lighter pencil, so I'm back on my H. Also, when you're trying to draw things realistically, I'm not talking about like manga or cartoony style or any specific style that you would use, but if you're trying to just draw things realistically, make sure that you don't have lines showing things. If you need to put a line somewhere, like you've got an object and then you've got a background, and if you feel that you need to put an outline to separate them, it means that one of these is not dark enough. So there's always, because in real life we don't really have outlines around us, around objects, so it means that one surface is a little bit darker than the other. So you can usually resolve and remove the outline of the object just by shading one or the other. And again, it comes to actually observing your composition very seriously before you start. And again, I've got a video on that on Patreon, the correct way and steps to observing your compositions and objects before you start drawing or painting them. So usually with natural light, you would have vertical surfaces that would actually catch more shadow than the horizontal ones. But you see, in this case, it's the other way around, and simply because the wall is white and the table is gray. But if they were the same color, then this would be lighter than that. It just has something to do with the way the light travels. So you see how I'm trying to haze out this shadow a bit more. By the way, this was a natural light, this was just coming from the window, so you get really soft shadows. With artificial light, it's very often, especially if you just have one light going from one direction, very often you would have much harsher, sharper shadows. And if you are learning to draw, my tip is make sure that you use images, or if you can set up a good setting for you to draw, make sure that you have just one light source. When you've got 2 or 3 light sources, you get this really weird thing going on where you've got really soft shadows spreading everywhere and you've got light going everywhere. So say for example, if you go into a Google search and you start looking for things like apples or whatever, they would be quite strange to draw, and just a little bit too artificial, I'd say. So if you are learning, you know, if you just want to improve your skill, I'd say go for the realistic sort of a setup, and try and find something where you've got just one light direction, because then you've got clear light and clear shadow. And then as you improve, you can work with 2, 3, or you know, whatever you want to look, you want to create. And see, even though I'm working on the background, I'm still constantly going back and to the apple and adding more stuff. Okay, now I'm gonna go back for 2B. Okay, so what we need to do now, there's actually a dark shadow there because of one sort of a thing sitting on the other and casting a bit of a shadow. So I'm going to put that in. Okay, and now I need to carefully go over some areas and see if I need to highlight them again, oops, or not. So what also happens is, even when you're using this sort of a thing, you place it on, you remove it, sometimes it moves a bit as your hand moves, and you're still smudging some areas. So when you're getting really close to finishing something, a really good tip is to go over all of the highlights with your rubber and just freshen them up a little bit. Sometimes they can go so dark that you're actually amazed how much lighter they can get once you've gone over them with the rubber. And just a little bit over here. And this is just the tricky part about our vision. When we've got objects that are dark and that are light next to each other, it doesn't actually happen naturally, but this is the way our eye receives it, is that the part that's darker gets just a little bit darker closer to the side where it meets the light object, and light object gets just a little bit lighter when it gets closer to the dark object. It's not something that happens, but it's the way that we receive that information. So you can always use that to your advantage, because remember, we are trying to create 3D illusion on a 2D surface. I have a feeling this is going to be a very long video once I edit it, because I don't want to cut too much out. I want you to see the whole process. So actually, please let me know in the comments if you would want to have more of these longer sort of draw along tutorials, or if you would rather be happier with me breaking things down and doing lots of shorter videos. I'm actually quite curious what would work better for you guys. Okay, so same thing here, just getting it just tiny a little bit lighter on the side there. There actually is a really strong light line naturally because of what the material is. I think we're there. I think this is all finished, so please remember, subscribe if you haven't subscribed, give it a thumbs up if you like the video, and let me know if you actually like having longer videos or you'd rather have shorter videos, more compact with more information. Then when I'm editing them, I can actually speed up the process, you know, of things that are a bit longer. So yeah, let me know, that will be very helpful. And thank you for drawing with me, guys. Hope you all have a lovely day.